Welcome to Primal Defense Combat Systema. I'm Andrew Grapsis, a certified instructor under Kevin's course. Today we're going to be talking all about breath. We've been talking about breath, but right now we're going to actually talk about the biomechanics of breathing. So really what we're going to be talking about is how does our body actually physically breathe, and how do we want to be thinking about our breath in order for us to take a full, strong, powerful breath while performing work. There are many different ways to breathe, and when we're talking about the breath, we have to divest ourselves of this notion of the air filling our lungs. That is the simplest kind of beginning concept of breathing. You'll hear people talk about breathing into your stomach or into your belly, and you'll hear people talking about breathing with the chest, and they'll begin having these conversations about them. It's important to understand there really is only one way to breathe, and that is that your lungs fill with oxygen, and then your lungs push all of that oxygen out. The functionality of exactly how that occurs can change, and we'll get into how that changes. But if somebody tells you to breathe into your arm or tells you to breathe into your stomach, you're not actually filling that location with air. It's rather some type of conceptual instrument used for changing how the muscles and tendons involved with breathing are interacting. So from a simple perspective, when we look at the body, there's actually two primary cavities we're concerned with when we're discussing breath. At the top, we have the thoracic cavity. And if you recall, when we were talking about the spine, we have our lumbar curve, our thoracic curve, and our cervical curve. So when we're talking about the cavity, it is actually really divided in relation to how the spine itself is divided. So we have this top portion over here, which is our thoracic cavity, and we have the abdominal cavity below that. And additionally, we have a pelvic cavity here as well. But when we're talking about breath, we're really talking about the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity contains your lungs. The abdominal cavity contains the vast majority of your other organs. So we have all of our digestive organs located around here. Separating the two cavities is our diaphragm. And you'll hear people talk about breathing with your diaphragm all the time. First thing that we have to dispel is this notion of breathing without the diaphragm. The only way to breathe is with the diaphragm. The diaphragm has to contract and relax in order for us to perform respiration. The diaphragm is basically a set of muscles and tendons that are below the lungs. They sit below the lungs, so over here. And they're shaped roughly like a parachute or some type of like melted blob of doom. And basically, they're connected at the top by a large tendon known as the central tendon, and then there are several additional connective points along the diaphragm, including connections to the sternum and the lumbar itself. When the diaphragm contracts, it actually kind of squishes itself, moving like this. And basically, it's going to create some type of void in the thoracic cavity. And that void is going to create a pressure system that forces breath into the lungs. So by creating a void of pressure, we're going to be drawing breath in. It creates a vacuum, in essence. When the muscles of the diaphragm relax, they expand. And as such, it forces breath out of the lungs. So, important idea, and it almost seems a little counterintuitive. When we breathe in, that's actually muscles of the diaphragm becoming tense and contracting. And then when we breathe out, those are the muscles relaxing. So one of the reasons we feel so good when we exhale has to do with the fact that it is an actual relaxation of our diaphragm. Now, there are many different ways to move the diaphragm around when we're breathing. Generally, we're talking about belly versus chest breathing. What we're really doing is isolating that central tendon, that main tendon that attaches the diaphragm to the body. And what's kind of important to know is it's really a question of, do we isolate the mobility of the tendon and prevent it from moving, or do we allow it to move freely? At the end of the day, the air has to go somewhere. Our lungs have to have the capacity to expand. So the diaphragm will move accordingly. It's just a question of which muscles of our own we relax and contract. When we're talking about belly breathing, usually the kind of exercise that's canonically used is to put your hand on your belly and your hand on your chest and attempt to move the hand on the belly while isolating the chest so that the chest doesn't move. And that's what they believe belly breathing is. They're actually moving all of these abdominal muscles. And they're like, that's healthy, that's good, it's great for me, it gets me a deep breath. But that's not really what we want in application. It's not really how we want to be performing our breathing. The converse of that, which is usually called chest breathing, is someone expanding into the top of the chest, not moving the belly, and usually there's some type of sympathetic movement in the shoulders. Now, in both cases, I'm over-exaggerating a little bit, but I'm over-exaggerating to illustrate a point because oftentimes these techniques are taught without real consideration of what they mean from a biomechanical perspective, and they're taught as if they are the only two methodologies of breathing, and that is just not true. So at the end of the day, our diaphragm, which is dividing that thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity, when it contracts for the inhale, we need to have an increase of space in that thoracic cavity in order for those lungs to expand. That space can come from the abdominal cavity, and that's what a belly breath is. Or it can come from expansion in the thoracic cavity without necessarily requisitioning the abdominal cavity, and that's what a chest breath typically is. So when we're taking a chest breath, obviously in the exaggerated form, we're going to open our ribs. We're going to potentially elongate all of the muscles of the ribs. So we're going to allow them to expand and fill. And then they'll all contract back down when we exhale. For the abdominal cavity, what we're going to do is essentially allow the diaphragm to drop. So the diaphragm will physically move thanks to that central tendon. It'll physically move downward, and it'll actually take over space that was previously occupied by the abdominal cavity. In doing this, your body actually has to reorganize some of the organs that are in there. Nothing fancy. It's not like when you go through pregnancy and your body does major reorganization and house cleaning. Instead, it's just going to be some pressure pushing down the organs of your body. So if our diaphragm is here, when we take in that belly breath, our diaphragm is going to drop. And that's where we get one of the sensations of that fullness of breath when we do belly breathing. And it's also one of the reasons you start to feel tight in your stomach. And then when we exhale, this requires that central tendon to be mobile. Now, the central tendon itself isn't a contracting tendon. It doesn't really have any of its own capacity to contract. Instead, it relies on the muscles of the diaphragm doing the work itself. So what type of breathing are we looking for? Well, I generally breathe based off of how I learned from voice training and Alexander technique. And my personal preference is to expand my ribs as far as they will go. This feels extremely comfortable for me. Does that mean that it's a pure chest breath? Absolutely not. It's important to understand when people talk about chest breathing versus belly breathing, it's not so black and white. It really isn't this definitive postmark on either side. We can breathe with a gradient somewhere between the two. And we can allow expansion into the abdominal cavity while still allowing expansion of the thoracic cavity through our ribs. Generally, when people are talking about expanding your ribs while breathing, the experience that I've had is that they kind of put their hands here and they try and feel that movement. You can actually see my hands move. If you just look at the distance between my middle fingers as they touch when I'm in this exhaled state and separate, you can see that there's sympathetic movement in my shoulders as the entire thoracic cavity fills. When I was learning to breathe with the expansion of the ribs, originally in voice lessons, I kind of had this two-dimensional idea where really there were only these very singular vectors that these ribs over here can move. And that would be kind of like out in this direction, like this. So I always expanded my ribs kind of outward. And just these ribs right here. As I got into Alexander technique, I learned, well, your ribs can expand everywhere. And this kind of should make intuitive sense. We obviously have ribs in our back as well, and we want to focus not just on expanding here in the front of the base of the ribs, but in the back of our ribs as well. So we want a full 360 expansion. And that's going to include expansion allowing the diaphragm to drop at least a little bit, so we do attain some level of belly breathing. So when we're doing this, you kind of want to put one hand on either side and just allow deep breaths. And you actually should be able to feel, ideally, a little bit of expansion in the back. Are you going to feel a major amount of expansion, your back exploding outwards? Absolutely not. But we want to feel a little bit of mobility on that hand that's on the back. And we want to practice expanding those ribs. We want those ribs expanded. We want a little bit of expansion into the abdominal cavity so that we can achieve a good level of bracing in case we're engaged in some type of activity, whether it's a pull, a push, taking a hit, we're lifting something heavy. We want to make sure that we have that breath to support our activity. Now, one of the reasons that this might be challenging is that you may not have good abdominal muscle development. So you might notice if you have weak abdominal muscles that controlling the amount of contraction that occurs is challenging. Additionally, your ribs may be overly tight and not mobile. Okay, so that's the biomechanics of our breath. I'm going to leave with one little exercise to begin working on relaxation of our ribs, allowing us to have the most optimal expansion possible. So go ahead and take your hands, take those middle fingers, place them on the base of your lower ribs so that you can the pinky is at the very bottom of the ribs. Fold them over, allow the middle fingers to touch, find a nice structural posture. And when we breathe in, we're going to breathe in fully, and I want you to allow the ribs to float as freely as they can and expand as widely as they can. And then we're going to hold our breath. And we'll do this a few times. And again, it's something to take into your own practice. All right? So breathe in fully. Hold. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. All right, we're going to do a lot of additional exercises to help loosen all of the muscles and get as much flexibility as we can into everything related to our thoracic cavity and our abdominal cavity so we can have as much mobility as possible, not just in the diaphragm, but in all the muscles that are around the diaphragm that may inhibit our breath. Our ultimate goal is to have a free-flowing breath that is not inhibited by any of our musculature. I know that was a lot. I know there's a little bit of biological and physiological conversation in there. I tried to make it as light as possible while still being practical and applicable. Let me know how you think it went. Leave comments, and as always, stay safe.